And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hey, Lisa.
Hey, Josh. Evening, everyone.
Oh, happy Wednesday night. Good to be back on Dark Ozarks on Facebook.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We've had a interesting conversation over on Instagram, and
Yes, and really talking a lot about the the context, the historical and the cultural context surrounding what is our primary subject tonight, which is the Battle of Wilson's Creek.
yes, yes, a fairly early battle,
Mhm.
considered by some maybe one of the more significant actions in the Western theater.
Yes.
Um, August 10th, 1861, and it was a very hot summer in wool uniforms.
Oh, I can't. It's hard for me to even imagine what that would have been like even before you were called to go into battle.
Yeah, we were discussing air conditioning before we went live, and it's uh, wool, heavy wool, no air conditioning, and they 90 towards 100 degrees uh,
Yeah,
during the campaign,
yeah, absolutely. And
which
just
I
as it,
did
oh,
play a role in the outcome, particularly for the Union, because they ended up marching much further in the heat, and I think all of those factors affected the outcome.
yeah, and in any situation like this, within any battle or any theater, um, and just the human factor has to be taken into consideration.
Hmm.
But at this early stage of military industrialization, the human factor still took an incredible factor. I mean, that was massively important because you're dealing with individuals who, to a large degree, were walking
Hmm.
in order to reach the battlefield, and in some cases, walking hundreds of miles,
Hmm.
sometimes further. Something again, we discussed some of the context, but I still think it's important to hit on it again. How early the Civil War was months old.
Yes, I
Uh,
mean,
the
Fort Sumter
uh,
fell in April, and we mentioned before, but the first large land battle was at Carthage, Missouri, in
yes.
5th. This is basically a month later.
Hmm. And the Battle of Bull Run, the first Battle of Bull Run, was July 21st.
Yes.
We're to such a large degree, for the Western theater of the war, is oftentimes dealt with in history books almost as an addendum.
Hmm. A
and
footnote, basically, yeah.
and I think that's really unfortunate. And when you start taking things like the Battle of Carthage and the Battle of Wilson's Creek occurring so early in the war into account, and then of course the incredibly brutal uh, guerrilla campaigns that were waged, coupled
Mm.
with a very heavy-handed federal response against, in part, civilian targets, you're dealing, and with the fact that Missouri was, for strategic and industrial reasons, a linchpin of
Mhm.
federal success, which again, it can be conjectured that Lincoln and his cabinet made some very difficult decisions of ethics in terms of how to wage the war here in order to ensure the greater good of the continuation of the Union. That the war in Missouri, or the war in the Ozarks, which would of course include Arkansas, was not an addendum. It was not a footnote. It
Mhm.
was crucial to the war effort as a whole.
It really was, and there are several points that things could have gone much differently, that potentially could have affected the larger outcome. And we mentioned over on Instagram, but I think it bears repeating that even Lincoln was very, very concerned with what was happening here, particularly in Southwest Missouri. And as they are strategizing and planning, his biggest state, he would say that his biggest fear was that what was happening here with the guerrilla warfare would spread across the country, and the planners and the generals and all estimated that if that happened, it would take another 20 years to end the war.
And obviously a situation that would really destroy whatever had been left of the American dream, of a unified nation, and destabilized, in all likelihood, destabilize much of the continent.
Well, yes, and then and you have to also, we don't think about it today, but at that juncture, you had to realize that there were other major powers that were sitting back watching, that depending on if we imploded, would have filled the vacuum. Britain,
Yes.
Mexico. We tend to think of ourselves as a much superior partner in North America, but Mexico definitely was a major power at the time in the Western Hemisphere, and still nursing some resentment from the Mexican War.
Yes.
So it definitely could have been a much different post-war scenario.
Mm-hmm. Of course, I really think there were a number of Confederate strategists who were hoping that they could turn the tide of the war just enough to get Britain to step in, much in the same way that France had stepped in with the colonies during the Revolution.
Mm-hmm. And Britain did step up trade, and of course they pretty much were rooting for the South, because they traded more with the South, because they had the industrial complex that the North had. They weren't concerned so much with the industrial goods. They wanted the tobacco and cotton.
Mm-hmm. And something, and this is an aside, but I find it interesting. Elements an easily overlooked aspect of plantation culture was, slavery aside, much of plantation culture seemed to have a very strong affinity with an Anglo-Saxon history and a connection to Britain.
It did, and of course, you can't say, the same is very much true of New England as well, but it really, there was an affinity there, definitely, and that did not fade.
No, and I think to a certain degree, in terms of some of the old family history, it still exists.
Mm-hmm.
In that regard, I think it's fascinating, and that this is painting with rather large brushes in this particular regard. But I think something that facilitated that, and of course, this is important because both New England and the Deep South, the influences of their culture impacted the Ozarks in a variety of ways, whether through settlement or trade, or political, or in some cases military involvement. But I think much of the English connection with New England, that there, after the Revolution and the War of 1812, there was an aspect of sort of spunky severance that They said, we're creating our own nation, you people back off.
Right.
Where the elements of deep South plantation culture, especially with the direct connection with the cotton trade and the tobacco trade, and the fact that the deep South was obviously much less involved in the revolution than New England in terms of policy direction,
True.
that there was still that sense that we're associated with our mother country and we share in its culture, a gentility, if you will, that the industry and Puritanism and and rampant abolitionists of New England, that they were very, very far removed. You can't help but think that to a large degree on some of these grand plantations of the Deep South, where even today it would be a considerable drive to get from, say, Massachusetts to the Deep South of Mississippi. That's a hike. How much more of a hike when you're walking?
Yeah.
That there had to be, certainly in the early days of the war, just an idea that somehow the decisions made in DC or by Lincoln could somehow impact or change their lives in any way had to be almost unfathomable.
Well, I think that's true. But there are a number of examples in the Western theater where actually those policy decisions by Lincoln and by Jefferson Davis actually really did play out for the first times in the Western theater. Good example of that would be when Jefferson Davis, early in 1862, when the Union started mustering Black troops in, Davis came out with his edict that they would not be honored as prisoners of war if captured.
Mm.
They would either be killed or pressed back into slavery, even if they'd been freemen. To which Lincoln really didn't have much choice but to respond that if you won't honor our prisoners of war, that we won't yours. So basically, you kill our guys, we'll shoot your guys. And
Yes.
the sort of one of the very first places, actually, the first place that played out was actually in Southwest Missouri.
Mm. Wow.
And in the aftermath of the burning of Sherwood.
Yes. Yeah. Which brings it suddenly again very close to home. So coming back to, I'm painting some of this again with some broad brushes, but St. Louis had the federal armament.
Mm-hmm.
Nathaniel Lyon was from Connecticut. He was described, at least by one writer, as a fiery abolitionist general from Connecticut, sent into the wilds of Missouri to save the Union.
Oh, I should tell you, you may not know this, but
What's that?
sort of aside and sort of small world factors, our showrunner
Mm-hmm.
is a direct descendant of Nathaniel Lyon.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
Talk about small world, right?
Very small world. Very, very small world. So the Missouri was largely in unrest.
Mm-hmm.
Federal troops came largely en masse to St. Louis to secure St. Louis.
Mm-hmm.
And then the new capital of Jefferson City apparently voted otherwise. Is that right?
Well, the state, the state government was rather divided. Well, the legislature was divided because Missouri tended to fall into three camps. You had your strong union men, you had your conditional union men, who basically is, I don't care what the South does, and I don't care if South Carolina secedes, but we stay in the union. Just don't change anything here. Don't change slavery, whatever. And then you had your secessionists and Southern supporters. But we had a new governor who came in same time Lincoln did, Claiborne Jackson, who had kind of run on a middle road platform of, we stay in the Union, but let's try to keep everything the same here and let the South do whatever they're going to do.
Yeah.
But quickly changed to, let's secede. And he took the state militia and called them up, created a camp, which he named after himself, Camp Jansen, outside Jefferson City. And once the Confederacy was established, he started even naming the streets of the camp after Southern generals, things like that. And he started raiding federal armories at Westport and Liberty and so forth. I think Kirksville too. And so St. Louis was the biggest federal armory, and that, of course, was a concern. Secondly, Lincoln had ordered Missouri to muster 75,000 men, and Jackson refused. So that was the beginning of the controversy. And so, as you said, General Lyon was rather a fiery general. He went undercover and with an aide, and the general actually was disguised as a woman, and infiltrated Camp Jackson to see what was going on, and figured out, that they really were planning on trying to turn the state over to the Confederates. And his reaction was to summon the governor and his aides to St. Louis and, put it very bluntly that he was there to enforce the president's orders. And if they were not willing to disband the militia, not willing to muster the men as ordered, that he was not going to guarantee their safety. And so they head back to Jefferson City, blowing up the railroad bridges because they think the Union is going to attack them, which she didn't. And they decided to march south to Arkansas to try to reach the regular Confederate Army under General McCulloch.
Yes.
And so that's how it all got to Southwest Missouri. We ended up with a battle in July in Carthage. The Union encamped in Springfield. Jackson did take his men to Arkansas, and McCulloch marched north. And then in August, they met at Wilson's Creek.
Yes.
12 miles south, then 12 miles south of Springfield, but considerably less distant from the city limits today.
Yes. Now, coming back to, if memory serves, Sterling Price became leader of the Missouri Home Guard, essentially, or state. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. And Sterling Price was the general who was essentially leading the now Confederate Army at Wilson's Creek.
Yes.
So interesting, especially as you dig into this, realizing that on the ground it could be brother against brother, but at the top level, so many of these major figures in essentially the top brass also knew each other.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, yes. I mean, they did. I mean, it was, sort of a small world. There was a small circle of people, and the regular Army officers had all been serving in the Federal Army until a few months before.
Yes, and it's so again. I mean, it's very confusing. There's a lot of moving parts, but Wilson's Creek, ultimately over 2,000 casualties in 6 hours,
Mhm.
um, along no big surprise, along Wilson's Creek. Um,
Yes.
and that something that really stuck out to me in the literature that I reviewed today, um, is it mentioned the Wilson's Creek community, which is a very Ozarks concept, that there would be these small communities that were towns but were not towns.
Right. They
And
basically were a little more than encampments.
yes, something that is has become very um to me, it's incredibly Ozarkian. Something I've become used to, but I realize that many of our viewers might not be aware of that concept, particularly in the 19th century. That there would be, particularly along creeks, spring branches, etc., or confluences of creeks, that these communities would spring up of small homesteads
Mhm.
that you would not have, for example, a post office. It would not be a recognized town. It would not show up on a map, even a historical map in many cases. And yet they were within the community or within the region. They were, I think, oftentimes had mills, and they were recognized as a community hub
Yeah.
where individuals within that space would be able to see their neighbors to a large degree. There would be traffic in and out from the mills,
Mhm.
and oftentimes a school and a church, and many of the hallmarks of an early American settlement
Mhm.
that certainly I suspect um, had really been developed and existed uh, since the early colonies in
Mhm.
concept, until the settle the communities would either be abandoned or subsumed into a larger community. And that might have become really infrequent in the East, but in the 1840s and 1850s, comparatively late in the process, um, that it was very common here in the
Mhm.
Ozarks. And Wilson's Creek was one of those. The Ray House, or the Ray Farm, was a key component, and probably the largest house. Do you think that would be fair?
I think my understanding is that's correct. Yes. When Mr. Ray came, I forget where. I want to say Tennessee. He came from
Yeah,
Tennessee or Kentucky. One.
yeah,
Um, he'd been a widower. He came there with a daughter, and another settler became widowed, and they married, and so um, they had they combined their land,
yeah,
and so he had a sizable farm, and then he was also the postmaster. Um,
yes,
and and a lot of people may not, particularly if you aren't, maybe even if you do live in this area, but for those outside the area, um, the dynamics here were, being a border state, were a lot different. That as a postmaster, it was a federal contract. He had
hmm,
had that contract before the war. He maintained it throughout the war, although he owned slaves.
yes,
Um, and those contracts were reviewed during the war, and if the union felt that someone was compromised, they didn't keep the uh, the contract. So it's an example of, although he owned slaves, he was considered a strong union man.
yes, which is very indicative of the complexities of the culture, particularly here in Missouri. In some cases, fiery pro-Confederate soldiers and or ultimately vigilante outlaws
Mhm.
who never owned slaves, and in all likelihood were probably not even interested in slavery,
Yeah.
fighting for a variety of reasons, not the least of which being a deeply embedded sense of honor.
Yeah.
It's messy, to say the least. Something that I love about Wilson's Creek is, of course, the Ray House was right on the old Wire Road,
Mhm.
which in its current iteration is essentially Highway 13, and the old Wilderness Road or the old Wire Road. So it's where the telegraph wires went,
Yeah.
and it was the Butterfield stage line
Mhm.
that to me this is fascinating, in the sense, so in 1859, I'm reading off my notes. In 1859, I never have notes. I have notes tonight. 1859, the Butterfield Overland Stage began using the Wire Road as its route from Tipton, Missouri to San Francisco.
Mhm.
I think that's incredible. Very few things are as iconic to the Old West as the stagecoach.
Yes.
Incredibly romanticized. I think if anyone rode in one for more than 5 minutes, it would probably become markedly less romanticized.
Well, in fact, if people want to, if they want to search back on the page, a few months ago, we did some posts about the Butterfield Overland Stage, and
Yes.
which included in the first trip to San Francisco, there was a reporter from New York, and we highlight some of his observations. And so, if you read those posts, it's very evident that it's not exactly, a pleasant trip.
No, and for, when we say, oh, we're going to go 1,000 miles, they actually meant it.
Yes.
In that regard. I don't know if anybody else besides me remembers the great 1970s comic strip Tumbleweeds,
Yes.
but there's a great comic strip that had the stage bouncing and rumbling through like 6 panels, and then finally pulls up on the edge of a cliff, and then the driver says, there'll be a short stop here for anybody who wants to throw up.
That pretty well fits the firsthand account of that first trip. So
Yes, and there's a couple of elements. I think the Ray family experience really brings home the humanity, sort of the observational humanity, the everyman's perspective, because they were civilians. They're and to me this is incredibly, I think incredibly important to wrap your head around, for people to wrap their heads around. They're, you know certainly many of the thousands of soldiers who came into this particular conflict, this 6-hour conflict on August 10th of 1861, had gone to considerable effort, either of their own volition or being sent, obviously by orders, to get to this point.
mhm.
The Ray family, their involvement in this horrific and historic event was simply to be living in their house.
Yes, their day
And
started out normal.
yeah, until it suddenly wasn't.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that, there's a couple of notes here. The Rays were aware of the impending military activity as they conducted their daily routines in August of 1861. By August 9th, a Southern army of over 10,000 troops was camped all along Wilson's Creek. On the morning of August 10th, some of the Ray children were outside tending to their horses when a Confederate soldier told them to take shelter because there was going to be a fight.
Mhm. Yes.
I would challenge anybody who's, is involved in our conversation tonight to think about what that would mean on a personal level if that happened to you. I think about it right now. I'm sitting in my house. I'm not bothering anybody. I'm just trying to live my life. And the idea that suddenly a modern firefight is going on in the woods across from my house.
Exactly. And then your house becomes the hospital.
Yes.
And sort of the epilogue to that is after the battle was over, the Union troops left. They retreated to Rolla because the troops were exhausted and the supply line was weak.
Yes.
And the Confederates then moved into Springfield. So now the Rays were completely in Confederate territory.
Yes.
However, they had heaping mounds of literally hundreds of amputated limbs
Yes.
and bodies heaped outside their window, because as the operations went on, they literally were throwing limbs out the window. And
Yes.
Mr. Ray sent a letter to the Confederate command in Springfield about 2 months later, asking if they would send a detail to help bury the limbs, because he and his sons were not able to keep up with burying. They had been burying limbs for 2 months.
It's almost impossible to conceive
Yes.
the human toll and the psychological toll.
I can't imagine the effect of that.
No. So for people who are wondering what, ground warfare in the Ozarks looked like,
That's pretty much it.
look out your window and imagine. In horror, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to come back to that because it is so macabre. But in addition to that, one of the moments that stole the show, so to speak, was the death of General Nathaniel Lyon.
Yes, on Bloody Hill.
Yes, I've been to Bloody Hill.
Mm-hmm.
Been under the oak trees of Bloody Hill.
Yeah.
And Bloody Hill was also covered with oak scrub at the time, and it's the main reason I believe that the Confederates gave the hill the name Oak Hills, and the Confederates called the battle the Battle of the Oak Hills, which minus the word battle would of course make a lovely name for a subdivision until you realize what it's about. But Nathaniel Lyon, and first his horse was shot out from under him.
Yes.
And then he was shot out from under himself.
Yes, and actually, I'll have to see if I can find it. I've found it before, but for anyone interested, if you can go to the Library of Congress, there is a series of videos that were interviews and just videos taken in the 1930s, early 1930s, of Civil War reunions of soldiers. And there is one that there's a Confederate veteran and a Union veteran from Missouri, and they tell their details. But the Confederate soldier tells the story of watching Nathaniel Lyon die. And he said he shot off his horse, that a number of soldiers, Confederate soldiers, then attack him. get it, get his sidearm away from him. He continues to fight to the point of throwing rocks at his attackers. And basically the man says, "I've never seen a more brave man in my life."
Yeah.
Although he was fighting against him.
Yes. Yes. Very, very fair. And again, it's part of that narrative that really speaks into the complexities of both sides. It
Yes.
speaks into the complexities of things like honor culture, into the complexities of things like General Lyon being willing. We know he was an abolitionist. We know he was in love with his nation, into his patriotism. And as terrible as the event is, to me, it's an incredible story because it is telling of great valor and honor on both sides.
Yes, definitely. And as you mentioned, him being an abolitionist and an opponent of slavery, irony, which often happened in Missouri, comes into play. His body is taken to the farmhouse, is covered in blankets, and then sort of by subterfuge is then taken to Springfield, which by this point is in total control of the Confederates, and taken to the farmhouse of John Phelps and his wife Mary. And Colonel Phelps was a colonel in the Union Army, and at Rolla, he was in charge, basically in charge of the camp at Rolla. And so his wife and children were at the farmhouse, now in enemy territory and in possession of General Lyon's body. So Mary has him a grave dug in her root cellar, and he spends the next 2 years buried in Mary Phelps' root cellar until they are able to then get him on a train and send him back to Connecticut.
Yes.
And ironically, the Phelps are slaveholders.
Right.
So, but she and Mrs. Phelps was actually given commendation from Congress for her bravery in protecting his body, and given an award of $20,000 for her service.
Yes.
And she used that money to establish an orphanage for orphans of the war.
Wow. Which again, we have the capacity of human beings not only to be so frustratingly complex as to not make sense to us 150 years later, but also this constant buffering together, from extraordinary nobility to extreme barbarism, and a variety of points in between. I want to look more into this. I haven't, outside of it being related by Samuel Clemens, i.e. Mark Twain, in Life on the Mississippi. The story of, for example, I'm going to offer this as a counterpoint to human nobility during the Civil War, just because of the complexities that it brings, of, for lack of a better word, a pirate island on the Mississippi that was basically focused on human trafficking, but it was specifically and very horrifyingly focused on sending individuals who were posing as abolitionists to plantations to encourage slaves to run away, simply so they could be captured and resold over and over. And that if the individual who had been encouraged to run away ever got wise to the fact, then they just kill
Yeah.
him. All of these, it speaks to the reality of human nature, which is both can be enlightened, it can be noble, it can be honorable, regardless of what side anyone's on. At the
Hmm.
same time, it can be horrifically abject and brutally primitive and really absolutely terrifying. And all of these things come together in the narrative of this war. Something that bringing a little bit of Springfield from past to present. Of course, Phelps Grove Park is the sort of centerpiece of the old Phelps farm,
Yes.
and I
Yes.
I wonder how many people have gone, and had uh, a nice, picnic at Phelps Grove Park, et cetera, or even potentially grown up in the neighborhood without ever knowing the history
Yeah.
of the individuals who went through this, or the fact that somewhere on that property, Nathaniel Lyon's body was buried for 2 years.
Exactly. Well, and then counterpoint, just how these individuals stepped up. Then after the war, um, Lyon's men, and of course, this is so early in the war as far as Lyons.
Yes.
Um, Basically, his men would come back to Bloody Hill, and they started placing rocks on the spot that he died. Some people
Yeah.
say at where the horse was shot, and his death was a few yards away, but this is where the soldiers remembered the act, and they would pile it, and it was the rocks of remembrance, and they grew to be pretty large, and it was sort of the first really unofficial monument of the war. And then um, they petitioned Congress to make a monument, and it was ordered to do so. And it was only one of five that they actually um, ordered to commemorate someone during the war itself, and it was the
Yeah,
first. So it the whole idea of the remembrance and everything in some ways really starts right there.
it does. It does. Another bit that I can't help but think about, because it takes me back to um, spring 2020, before things occurred.
Yes.
Uh, that then on Sunday afternoon, a very overcast Sunday afternoon, you and I met in a very modern hotel in
Mhm.
hotel lobby in Springfield.
Yes.
That it is rumored that Mr. Phelps haunts,
Yes. University Plaza.
and
Uh, um,
I
it's one of my favorite ghost stories in Springfield, actually. And again, most people walk around downtown Springfield and have no idea that they are in some places walking across Civil War you know embattlements, and not to mention mass unmarked graves. So
right,
yeah, and yes, the there are at least two um, in downtown Springfield of several hundred soldiers. And University Plaza was built, and not long after, uh, the story started of guests and employees seeing what appeared to be the figure of a man in Civil War uniform, including long officer's coat, and the staff started referring to him as the colonel. And there is speculation of whether or not it is Colonel Phelps, who, not in addition to being a Union officer, had been a congressman, U.S. congressman from Missouri, and later was governor.
yes.
So
Uh, What do you think? I know I already know, but I want to talk about this for a moment. the the cliched image of a haunting is that the
Mm.
haunting takes place in a spooky location. It takes place in an old house, an abandoned mine, a haunted forest, so on and so forth. But many, many hauntings, many moments of recorded paranormal activity take place in new locations.
They do. And a lot of people have this conception that ghosts are stuck to four walls. And so if those walls weren't there when that person was alive, then why are they there then? And also a lot of people assume, okay, so they're in this building, so they can't go anywhere else. And
Yes.
there are a number of hauntings where the same apparition is seen in multiple locations. So
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
if that creeps people out, then don't think about it too much. Um, but a lot of activity is tied more to events that happened and sort of tied to the land, not necessarily the building. So
Yes. Do you think so? For example, with University Plaza, they had to bulldoze a lot
mhm.
and do a lot of. Do you think that new activity like that of tearing up the old and that do you think that that can exacerbate activity, or is it simply that the activity was always there but now there's people in that space to observe it?
And the answer is yes to all of that, basically. It could have already been there. Who knows? Maybe this colonel or this officer's walking, that land for the last 160 years.
Yeah.
Um, he's just now walking the lobby and hallways and more noticeable, um, and running into people more. Um, by the same token, whenever a building or a place is changed, is worked on, often activity does increase, and it's almost um, seems like a lot of spirits don't like one. They don't like change. It almost
I can
as if
appreciate that.
yeah, this is the way things are. Why are you moving this wall? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Or maybe it just increases curiosity. Just the energy involved, allows more
Mhm.
interaction.
Yeah. So bringing it back to Wilson's Creek, of course I've been out there a number of times.
Hmm.
I do find it's a to me it's a very beautiful but a very somber
Hmm.
place, especially as you contemplate the dead,
Yeah.
for obvious reasons. It's a very historic place. It's a very, those rolling Ozarks hills at the Springfield Plateau that to me are very compelling. The creek is beautiful. Don't drink
Hmm.
the water. It's too close to Springfield.
Yeah.
Uh, but I will, be the first to posit that I myself have not had what I understood or recognized as any paranormal experiences on the location.
I have not personally either, although I've talked to people who have had. Um,
Yes, as have
and
I.
yeah, and they usually, in my experience, accounts kind of fall into two camps. One is Bloody Hill,
Hmm.
uh, people seeing soldiers, people seeing even cavalry, um,
Mm,
and phantom horses and riders.
yes,
And that may well, and there was aside from General Lyon dying there, that I mean, it was very, very heated fighting
yes,
on that hill.
yes.
So that, I mean, that would make sense.
Hmm.
Um, I've read accounts of someone, saying that, they've been there and heard, like the sounds of an agonizing, a man in agony, as if he'd been wounded or something. And that's certainly plausible. I mean,
Yes,
that would make sense. Um, then the other stories tend to center around the Ray House area, and
Okay.
and probably the one that is discussed the most and seems to perhaps have happened multiple times is visitors will see a young woman in period clothing that appears to be carrying a wooden bucket of water up the hill from the spring house as if she's going to the house, and people assume that she works there or something's going on reenacting that kind of thing, only to ask a ranger and there isn't anyone there.
Yes.
And whether that's connected directly to the battle or just having lived on the farm, no one knows for sure. But appears realistically enough that people mistake her for a living person.
Yes. Do you think, or have you heard of activity in association with that mound of limbs and the field hospital?
I've heard a few things of people saying, they feel like, they've heard voices at the house or around the house, or sounds of, you know, people moving and that kind of thing, but nothing very definite or real detailed. But
Yeah,
it's certainly possible. I mean, it's a lot of energy to be expended there.
it is. It really is. Of course, you've got the water there. You've got the road, the old
Hmm.
road. the, the reports that I had, again, secondhand, fragmented, was of individuals who were riding horses in the national park area, and that at various times the horses appeared to shy away from something that they couldn't see, and it sometimes they felt that they were encountering cold spots.
And that, I mean, that would make, I mean, that's all pretty consistent and would make sense. And similar to other experiences I've had at other battlefields. So,
Right. And it's now the pragmatic side of me is also going to caution people, when you have a situation of hills with cool water at the
mhm.
bottom. If it has been, for example, overall cool, and then you have a warm afternoon, you can experience a temperature inversion that will
Yeah,
cause that cool creek water to rush out of the valley. And
right.
I've experienced it a number of times. It is exhilarating and eerie,
Mhm.
um, but it is not paranormal activity, and so
No.
that is just something for people to keep in mind. I bring that up because the times that I've experienced it myself, was dealing with that the water, the creek, the hill, those types of things. It usually happens if it's going to happen. It usually happens late afternoon, just as
Mhm.
the sun starts to drop, which is a beautiful but kind of a liminal twilight moment
Yeah,
anyway. And the topography of Wilson's Creek contribute to that as a potentiality.
definitely. I agree there. And so any particular experience would have to be looked at considering all those factors. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, if if the rest of the environment does not, again, what you're looking at is basically a hot late winter day, or particularly late winter, because you want the water needs to be cold, the air needs to be comparatively cool, but then in the afternoon that in between space becomes very warm, and the
Yeah.
when the sun drops, it basically sucks that air out of the creek, or the creek area. But
And it can certainly be quite a startling experience, whether it's natural or not.
it is, there was one time, I'm digressing, but there was one time I was in my teens. We had, where I grew up, there's a very similar structure or similar topography. We had a deep ravine,
Hmm.
um, It was late February. There was snow on the ground, but of course, the water was very cold down there. But we'd had a really warm. It was like sunny and hit 60 degrees that afternoon,
Mhm.
and I was down sort of in the bottom, and the sun dropped, and not only did the temperature inversion happen, but the cold air coming out of the creek bed was so cold in comparison to the afternoon air that it was instantly forming a cloud of fog.
Yeah.
And so you see, suddenly there's this, it's all still, and the sun, twilight is hitting, and the air feels warm, and then suddenly there's just this draft of cold air coming from the depths, and then this billows of mist at the
Yeah.
same time. And it's like, did I just walk into Silent Hill? Is this bad? This might be bad. And I think, to me, those types of experiences are nearly as enchanting in some cases, if not more so, and in some cases more rare than the paranormal activity.
Oh, I that can be true. I think so. Yeah. Um, and it's easy to mistake one for the other too.
It is. It is. All that to be said, I think the likelihood of documentably real paranormal activity at Wilson's Creek is very likely.
Well, I do too. And we talked earlier. There's an account of actually someone that I know, um, during an investigation there, that um, two people could not hear each other. It was like a distortion in either time or space, and but there's different recollections, and so uh, who's to say what happened?
Yeah,
But something
very,
odd.
very, and sometimes when those odd things happen, you simply don't know exactly what it is.
That's true. But it's those moments that are good to pay attention. Um, and it's certainly a place that I could see a distortion in timer or space, and
Yes.
it reminds me of experience I had at the battlefield in Carthage, where people could not hear me.
Yes. I that really stuck out to me when I
Yeah,
read that reference, and then was thinking to your experience in Carthage. An encampment that is absolutely beautiful there by
mhm,
the spring in Carthage. I
yeah.
love that location. Oh, and I'm only remembering bits and pieces of this, but from some of my earlier research, the reference, the comparatively dry reference in the to the battle, mentions that Franz Siegel, who's a Union part of the Union, that his force was routed. It's a rather dry minor reference, but if memory serves, he was a St. Louis German who
Mhm.
was serving in the Union Army, possibly with some broken English, and his route, uh, if memory serves correctly, and I don't want to do him injustice, but I'm 99% sure that I'm right on this. His route largely involved him panicking in the middle of a cornfield, and running for the creek, and then showing up hours after the battle was done.
Um, in part, yes, because they thought that he was far more outnumbered in that location than he was, um, and which is a little ironic because he actually was he was a very proficient officer, and um, uh, went on to be brigadier general, I believe. And then later, ironically, after the war, was superintendent of the school system at either New York or Philadelphia. I mean, he was actually a major general. So yes, it was not, it was a moment that was miscalculated. Yes, definitely, but
Probably didn't relate that story from the war too often.
probably not. Probably not. Although I'm sure pretty much everyone, all of the officers had those moments. So at one point or
Yeah, yeah. Oh, very fair. Very fair. Uh, I I'm imagining now. I'm imagining um, Siegel being, teased by the students in New York that they might just like leave corn stalks on uh, the front steps of the school or something. But I don't know. Probably didn't happen.
maybe German folklore. Probably something about scarecrows that would
Oh,
that
absolutely,
frightening. Probably terrible.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I may have to rewatch Legend of Sleepy Hollow now.
There you go.
Oh, good times. So, anything else we want to cover tonight? That's kind of our take on the Battle of Wilson's Creek.
Yeah. What is your I guess what's your favorite ghost story related to the war?
Oh, related to the war. Let me think. Let me think. Of course, anything involving, and this is only peripherally, anything involving ghost riverboats. Certainly, there's. mm, I'm trying to remember where it is. There's, I believe, a schoolhouse down in Arkansas that there was continue to be reports of a soldier who would peek out of the windows.
Oh wow.
I found that one particularly interesting, especially just the sort of that hmm, tenuous but almost unbreakable link between these events that happen, how they move into the mythos of the culture and the substrate, and reappear, sometimes reconstituted as folklore.
I mean, that's true. I mean, you get those elements. I mean, you get those from the war with the with the phantom hound stories. Headless specters are fairly common. I wouldn't say fairly common, but more common than you would think from the war
Mhm.
in the Ozarks, which kind of
Yes,
harkens back to Sleepy Hollow.
it
Uh,
does.
but you get this sort of mythos around it.
And that, and I think this is a tenuous link. I will admit that. Um, but the art of individuals like George Kiefer, who
Mhm.
painted many of the murals at Silver Dollar City back in the 70s, um, and that genre of art style, to me, that it's very evocative of autumn, and those sort of the cornfields, the blue mountains, and the ghost stories.
Yeah,
And
I-
I, to me, that's incredibly evocative. And I don't think that you can tell those stories without taking the Civil War as a whole into account.
I think so. Your description right there that made a memory come to mind that maybe kind of encapsulates it a little bit. Had a lady a number of years ago um, telling me experience that would happen at their farm, which was, I want to say, around Diamond. So not too far from me, but maybe 25 miles. And she'd say that it happened. If it happened just once, she wouldn't have thought much about it and probably just thought she, had imagined it. But it happened several times that she'd be standing at her kitchen sink doing dishes and look out, and across her yard, across the road, they had a field, and she would see what looked like a Civil War soldier walking through the field. And at first she told her she was just daydreaming or what. And then, and it would go quite a long time in between seeing it. It's not like every day or anything. And then after she had seen it 5 or 6 times, she looks up one night, evening, he's walking across the field and he stops and turns towards her and waves. And I said, well, perhaps he died there. And her thought was, well, nothing happened here. And I think that sums up so much of the ghost stories of the Civil War in the Ozarks, or people think, well, nothing happened right here, but we had so many skirmishes and so many things that were either not recorded or were fairly vague. We know, well, this skirmish happened somewhere in this area, that you can never really say nothing happened here.
No.
But
No.
I think that kind of sums up ghost stories from the Civil War in those parts.
It does. It does. And as somber, as sobering, and as powerful as the great battlefields are, where we documented the dead. You mentioned sort of the ethical dilemmas and the conflicts early on between society and individuality.
Yeah.
And because of that, the Ozarks are littered with really an uncountable number of individuals who, in so many cases, would have contemplated their own dying, their last moments, their last moments of life, their last moments of consciousness in this realm, knowing that their families back home would never know what happened to them, knowing there would never be a marker, knowing that they were going, in essence, to die alone, unremembered, and forgotten.
Yes, and you mentioned early on, of course, the effect of honor, and particularly with the Southern influences, and touched on that a little bit, I think, with the soldiers coming back and piling the stones in honor of General Lyon. And it makes me, that's not just an isolated case. There's a tale of one of the Confederate Partisan Rangers that died in battle, Southwest Missouri. And the story goes, there's various versions as to what really happened to his body and where he was buried, including whether or not his men had retrieved it and buried it in secret. And there's a story that always reminds me of some of the tales from Scotland after Longshanes had outlawed weapons and bagpipes, that his men would gather at his grave in secret and reminisce, just as the Scots would gather in the hills in secret to play pipes.
Yeah. It's sobering. It really is. Maybe a good place to conclude.
I think so. So may all the ghosts of the past visit everyone this week.
Yes. Oh, and we look forward to next Wednesday for another episode of Dark Ozarks.
Yes, we do. And we thank everybody.
Yes, we do. Thank you all for listening. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Josh. And here's to more good stories next week.
Absolutely. We'll see y'all soon.